Okay, get ready to dive deep, because today we're tackling Epicurus.
Wow, you weren't kidding about a deep dive.
You know me. I mean, look at this stack of sources. We've got excerpts from The Art of Happiness by Epicurus himself,
Nice.
plus commentary by Daniel Klein and George Strodak, and a biography by Diogenes Laertius.
Oh, excellent. So we're really going all in on understanding Epicurus, not just his greatest hits. So
Exactly. This is beyond surface level, and trust me, Epicurus had some seriously radical ideas, even by today's standards.
I'm intrigued. What surprised you the most when you were going through the material?
Honestly, just how relevant his ideas about happiness and living a good life still feel today.
You're right. He was dealing with some pretty timeless questions. How to find happiness, how to navigate a world that often feels chaotic.
Even how to live a meaningful life when it feels like everything's constantly changing.
And he was tackling these questions over 2,000 years ago. It makes you wonder about those ancient Greek dinner party conversations.
Right. They must have been wild. But before we get lost in ancient Greece, let's focus on what Epicurus is best known for. His focus on pleasure.
Ah, yes, the Epicurean lifestyle. But, he's often misunderstood, reduced to someone who just advocates for indulging in every whim.
That's what I thought at first, too. But his philosophy is much more nuanced than that.
It really is. In fact, he had a rather counterintuitive definition of happiness, especially for someone so associated with pleasure.
Okay, now you've piqued my curiosity. How do you define happiness, if not by experiencing pleasure?
Well, Epicurus believed that happiness, true happiness, was actually about the absence of pain, both physical and mental.
Really? So it's more about avoiding pain than chasing pleasure.
Hmm.
That sounds almost, well, a bit bleak, doesn't it?
Not at all. Think of it like this. Imagine a life without physical discomfort, without anxiety, fear, or frustration. It's about reaching a state of inner peace and tranquility.
Ah, okay. It's like reaching a state of pure contentment where you're free from those nagging worries and anxieties. I think I see where he's going with this.
Exactly. And interestingly enough, this concept of finding happiness through the absence of pain has parallels in other ancient philosophies.
Oh, like what?
Well, Klein actually points out that two of Epicurus's early influences, Democritus and Pyrrho, traveled to India and encountered early Buddhist thought.
Wow, they went all the way to India back then.
It's hard to imagine, right? But it makes you wonder about the exchange of ideas even in ancient times.
Absolutely. The ancient world was far more interconnected than we often realize. But getting back to Epicurus, this idea of eliminating pain to achieve happiness, some might say that just gets you to neutral. How do you go from neutral to actually experiencing joy and fulfillment?
That's where his emphasis on pleasure comes in. But remember, for Epicurus, it wasn't about fleeting, indulgent pleasures.
Right. It wasn't about indulging in every whim. It was about something more profound, more lasting.
Precisely. It was about living in accordance with nature, about appreciating the simple pleasures of life, friendship, good conversation, a peaceful walk in nature.
So finding joy in the everyday, the kind of things we often take for granted.
Exactly. And he believed that by eliminating those sources of pain, those anxieties, fears, and desires that constantly pull us out of the present moment, we become free to experience those simpler, more authentic forms of pleasure.
It's like he's saying that true happiness is about finding a place of stillness, of tranquility within yourself, even when the world around you is anything but calm.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that inner peace so you can then appreciate the world around you more fully without the weight of those burdens.
That makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
But let's be realistic, living without any pain whatsoever. That feels a bit idealistic, don't you think? The world throws a lot our way.
Oh, absolutely. Epicurus understood that. He wasn't suggesting we could eliminate all pain. That's impossible.
Right.
But he did argue that we could minimize unnecessary suffering by understanding our place in the universe and by confronting some of our deepest fears.
Right. He was adamant about shedding anxieties about nature and the gods, which must have seemed pretty radical back then.
Oh, it was definitely a radical notion at the time. I mean, think about it. This was a time when people attributed everything, storms, diseases, even bad luck, to the whims of the gods.
And to make it even more interesting, Diogenes Laertius mentions that Epicurus's own mother was a fortune teller and a faith healer.
Talk about a front row seat to those anxieties. It makes you wonder how those experiences shaped his views. He must have seen firsthand how fear of the unknown, especially the fear of divine punishment, could create so much misery. It's no wonder he sought a different way to understand the world.
So instead of relying on the supernatural, he offered a rational explanation based on atoms. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, this idea that everything is made up of these tiny indivisible particles. He was way ahead of his time.
He really was. He built upon the ideas of Democritus, who first proposed the concept of atoms, but Epicurus took it further. He believed that everything, even our souls, was made up of atoms.
So everything we see, touch, feel, even think and feel, it's all just atoms, arranged and rearranged in countless configurations.
That was his theory. And he argued that by understanding these natural laws, these underlying principles that govern the universe, we could overcome our fears and anxieties and find a sense of calm.
That's a really empowering concept, finding peace through understanding. It's like he's saying that knowledge is the antidote to fear. But if we're all just atoms, what about free will? How did he reconcile a universe governed by physical laws with our ability to make choices?
That's where his concept of the atomic swerve comes in. It's one of his most debated ideas.
I've heard about this swerve. It's like a curveball in the world of atoms.
That's a great way to put it. Essentially, Epicurus proposed that atoms don't always move in a straight line, that there's an element of randomness to their movement. They can swerve.
So even in a universe governed by atoms and physical laws, there's room for chance, for things to happen that aren't predetermined. It's not all just a straight line.
Exactly. And this element of randomness, the swerve, was crucial for Epicurus because it allowed him to explain two very important things: free will and the formation of complex structures.
Okay, I can see how that would address the free will question. If our choices are predetermined, then we don't really have free will, do we? But how did this swerve explain the formation of, well, everything?
Well, imagine if atoms just moved in a uniform, predictable way. You'd end up with a very boring universe. The swerve allows for variation, for chance encounters between atoms, and those encounters can lead to the formation of increasingly complex structures, stars, planets, even life itself.
That's a pretty elegant solution to a complex problem.
Yeah.
He's basically saying that even in a universe governed by laws, there's still room for surprise, for novelty. And that's what makes life, well, life.
You got it. It's that element of unpredictability, of possibility, that makes the universe so fascinating. And for Epicurus, understanding those principles, even those elements of chance, was key to overcoming fear and finding a sense of peace in a world that often feels chaotic.
That's a great point. I mean, think about it, how much of your own peace of mind comes from understanding the world around you.
That's an interesting question.
Right. It makes you think. And it ties directly into another aspect of Epicurus's philosophy that I think is often misconstrued, his views on pleasure. People hear Epicurean and they think of someone who's just constantly indulging.
Right. They imagine someone who just lives for the moment, indulging in every whim, with no regard for consequences or the well-being of others. But as we've been discussing, Epicurus's philosophy was far more nuanced than that.
Right, he wasn't advocating for a life of reckless abandon. He was actually quite critical of those who live that way.
Exactly. For Epicurus, true pleasure, the kind of pleasure that contributes to a good life, couldn't be separated from virtue. It wasn't about seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake.
It was about making choices that aligned with your values and that contributed to a life of meaning and purpose. It was about living wisely, honorably, and justly, and finding pleasure in doing so.
Exactly. It's about aligning your actions with your principles. And importantly, Epicurus believed that many of the things people typically associate with pleasure, wealth, fame, power were ultimately fleeting and often led to more anxiety and suffering than genuine happiness.
It's that constant striving, that feeling of never having enough that he was cautioning against.
Precisely. He believed that by simplifying our lives, by reducing our wants and focusing on what's truly essential, we could minimize a great deal of unnecessary suffering.
So it's about finding that balance, right? And enjoying life's simple pleasures without becoming enslaved by them. It's like walking a tightrope between indulgence and deprivation.
Exactly. And to walk that tightrope successfully, Epicurus believed we needed a solid understanding of knowledge, of how we come to know what we know. He argued that our senses, while sometimes fallible, are the foundation of all knowledge.
It's that classic philosophical dilemma, isn't it? Our senses can deceive us. We've all seen optical illusions or mirages in the desert. So how can we be sure what we're perceiving is actually real?
It's a question that's plagued philosophers for centuries. And Epicurus recognized that our senses could indeed be tricked.
Yeah, we can misinterpret what we see or hear, especially if we're not careful.
Precisely. That's why he stressed the importance of verifying our perceptions, of not jumping to conclusions based on a single sense experience.
It's about cross-checking, getting a second opinion, making sure our senses aren't leading us astray. It's like that old saying, don't believe everything you see and only half of what you hear. And in today's world, With so much information and misinformation at our fingertips, that advice couldn't be more relevant.
I completely agree. It's about cultivating a healthy skepticism, questioning what we perceive, and seeking out multiple perspectives before forming an opinion.
Speaking of multiple perspectives, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about Epicurus the man.
Sounds good to me.
It's easy to get caught up in his ideas, his philosophies, but we shouldn't forget that behind those ideas was a real person with his own quirks and complexities.
Absolutely, and that's where Diogenes Laertius's biography becomes so valuable. He offers us a glimpse into Epicurus's character, his personality, and it challenges many of the negative perceptions that have been attached to him throughout history.
You know, we often make assumptions about philosophers based solely on their ideas, without considering the context of their lives, their personal experiences.
It's true, and it's a shame because those personal details can add so much depth and richness to our understanding.
Well, let's rectify that. Paint us a picture. What was Epicurus like? What kind of man was he?
Well, if you really want to understand Epicurus the man, you have to remember he was incredibly prolific.
Oh, right. He wasn't just writing for scholars and philosophers.
Not at all. He actually wanted to make philosophy accessible to everyone.
He sounds like quite the revolutionary.
He really was in many ways, and thankfully, even though he lived centuries ago, we have some of his actual words preserved.
That's right. We've got excerpts from some of his letters, and they offer incredible insights into his thinking.
They really do. I think people would be surprised to learn that Epicurus wasn't just a philosopher.
Oh, what else was he into?
Well, he was also a prolific writer, letters, treatises, even poetry. But sadly, only a fraction of his work has survived.
That's such a shame. Imagine all the knowledge that's been lost throughout history. But hey, at least we have these fragments. They're like little windows into his mind.
They really are. And one of the most illuminating, I think, is his letter to Herodotus.
Okay, what's so special about this particular letter?
Well, it's basically Epicurus's attempt to explain his atomic theory in a nutshell.
A crash course in Epicurean physics. Sign me up.
But where do we even start with something as fundamental as atomic theory? It's not like we can just pull up a periodic table.
That's true.
Yeah.
But remember, Epicurus was working with a very different understanding of the universe. He didn't have the tools and technology that we have today.
Right. No microscopes, no particle accelerators. So how did he even begin to formulate his ideas about atoms? Well, he was heavily influenced by Democritus, who's often credited with first proposing the idea of atoms. But Epicurus took those ideas and really fleshed them out, connected them to his broader philosophical system.
So it wasn't just about the science for him. It was about how those scientific ideas could help us live better lives.
Exactly. And that's what makes Epicurus so fascinating. He wasn't content to just theorize about the nature of reality. He wanted to understand how those theories could help us navigate the world, how they could alleviate suffering, how they could lead to greater happiness.
It's like he's saying, okay, so we have these atoms. Now, how do we use that knowledge to live better, more fulfilling lives?
Precisely. And to answer your earlier question about where we begin with atomic theory, Epicurus starts by outlining some core principles, some fundamental truths that he believes underpin everything else.
Give me an example. What's one of his core principles?
One of the most important is the idea that nothing arises from nothing. He argued that if things could just pop into existence from nothing, the universe would be completely unpredictable, utterly chaotic.
Right. There'd be no order, no rhyme or reason to anything. So he's saying everything must have a cause, even if we don't fully understand it yet.
Exactly. And this was huge for him because it allowed him to push back against superstitious beliefs, against the idea that things just happen for no reason or because the gods willed it so.
So instead of saying, oh, the gods are angry, that's why there's a storm, he's looking for a cause and effect explanation based on the natural world.
Exactly. And this tied directly into his mission to debunk superstition. He wanted to show people that the things they might attribute to gods or supernatural forces actually have natural explanations rooted in the interaction of atoms.
It's like he's saying, let's take a step back and look for the natural causes behind these phenomena rather than attributing them to something mystical or unknowable.
Precisely. He believed that by understanding these natural processes, we could alleviate a lot of unnecessary fear and anxiety. He even uses this principle, this idea that nothing comes from nothing, to explain the formation of the universe itself.
Okay, so how did the universe form, according to Epicurus? Was it the Big Bang?
Well, he didn't have the benefit of modern cosmology, but he did believe that the universe was not created by a divine being, but rather formed over eons through the interaction of atoms.
So no divine creator, no grand plan, just atoms bumping around, doing their thing.
Exactly. He imagined atoms swirling and colliding in an infinite void, and over unimaginable stretches of time, those collisions eventually led to the formation of stars, planets, and everything else we observe in the cosmos.
It's still a pretty mind-blowing concept even today. But it's amazing how far our understanding of the universe has come since Epicurus' time, just like he predicted it would.
He was definitely ahead of the curve on that one. But getting back to his core principles, another big one is the idea of the indestructibility of atoms.
Okay, what did he mean by that?
Epicurus believed that atoms are eternal. They can't be created or destroyed, only rearranged.
So even though objects break down, change, or decompose, the atoms that make them up are still out there, just in different forms.
Exactly. It's like that law of physics: matter can't be created or destroyed, only transformed.
Mind-blowing. And this had some pretty profound implications for his views on death, didn't it?
Absolutely. If everything, including our souls, is made of atoms and atoms are indestructible, then death is just a rearranging of those atoms.
So death is not an end, but a transition. That must have been a radical idea back then.
It was, and in some ways it still is today. Epicurus believed that understanding this principle could help us to overcome our fear of death. He saw it as a natural part of the cycle of existence, not something to be feared.
It's almost a comforting thought that the atoms that make up our being will continue to exist in some form, even after we're gone.
It is for some. Epicurus saw it as a source of comfort, a way to alleviate the fear of death, which he believed was one of the biggest obstacles to living a happy life.
It's amazing how he takes this complex concept, atoms, and connects it to these fundamental questions about life, death, and our place in the universe. He wasn't just interested in the physics of it all. He was exploring how those ideas could help us lead better, more meaningful lives.
Exactly. And that's what makes reading his work so rewarding. He constantly challenges us to think differently, to see the world from new perspectives. But let's move on from atoms for a moment, if you will.
Either way.
Let's look at his letter to Pythocles. In this one, he tackles those big, mysterious celestial phenomena that have captivated humans for millennia. The sun, the moon, the stars, eclipses, weather patterns.
And this is where his idea of multiple explanations comes into play, right? Like offering different possible causes for things like thunder or lightning.
You got it. He was really ahead of his time in his scientific thinking. He understood that we shouldn't limit ourselves to just one explanation when multiple possibilities might fit the observed facts.
It's like he was saying, let's not jump to conclusions. Let's look at all the possibilities, explore all the options before landing on an answer. It's a very modern scientific approach when you think about it.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, this was a time when most people attributed these phenomena to the actions of gods.
Right. Thunder meant Zeus was angry. It eclipsed.
Uh,
The gods were unhappy. So by offering natural explanations, he was really challenging the prevailing worldview.
Precisely. And he wasn't afraid to push those boundaries. He wanted people to see that we don't need to resort to the supernatural to make sense of the world around us.
So it's both a scientific and a philosophical approach. He was pushing the boundaries of knowledge while also challenging some deeply ingrained beliefs. What a fascinating mind.
He truly was a visionary. But his insights weren't limited to physics and cosmology. He also had a lot to say about ethics, about how to live a good life.
And that's where his letter to Minucius comes in.
Exactly. It's a goldmine of practical wisdom. Think of it as Epicurus' guidebook for navigating life's challenges and finding lasting happiness.
Okay, I'm ready for some of that Epicurean wisdom. What's the headline? So we've spent this deep dive really getting to know Epicurus, his theories about the universe, his surprisingly modern views on pleasure, his thoughts on navigating fear, and even death. And of course, the man himself, who sounds like quite a fascinating figure. But I have to ask, what does all this mean for us today? How can we actually apply Epicurus' wisdom to our own lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something Epicurus addressed head-on. Remember his letter to Minucius? It's almost like a blueprint for building a good life.
Right. It's his greatest hits of practical advice. It must have been quite the self-help book back in the day.
It really was. And it all begins with understanding what truly matters. Epicurus believed true happiness wasn't about chasing wealth, fame, or power. It was about finding inner peace, living in harmony with nature, and nurturing strong friendships.
It's that often repeated truth, isn't it? That lasting happiness comes from within, not from external things, though it's easier said than done in our very externally focused world.
Absolutely. But Epicurus provides a framework for getting there. He actually says, "It is not possible to live pleasantly without living wisely and honorably and justly, nor to live wisely and honorably and justly without living pleasantly." It's like he's saying true pleasure, the kind that contributes to a good life, can't be separated from living virtuously.
So it's not about seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake. It's about making choices that align with our values and contribute to a life of meaning and purpose. It's about recognizing that true fulfillment comes from aligning our actions with our principles.
That's a great way to put it. It requires us to pause and reflect, to weigh the potential consequences of our choices rather than simply reacting to our immediate desires.
It's that classic battle between instant gratification and long-term fulfillment. Do you think that's something people struggle with even more today, given how fast-paced our lives have become?
It's a good question, and I think you're right to point it out. We're constantly bombarded with messages urging us to buy now, achieve now, be happy now. But Epicurus would probably say that many of those messages are distractions from what truly matters.
So how do we tune out that noise and focus on those deeper values, those things that bring genuine and lasting happiness? How do we even know which pleasures are the right ones to pursue?
That's where we can turn to Epicurus's concept of natural needs and desires. He argued that we all have them the need for food, shelter, connection, friendship. By fulfilling those needs in a balanced and moderate way, we can achieve contentment without getting sidetracked by those empty desires.
Those desires for things that glitter but don't offer any real substance, like the pursuit of wealth for wealth's sake.
Exactly. Epicurus believed that by simplifying our lives, by reducing our wants and focusing on what's truly essential, we could minimize a great deal of unnecessary suffering and find a more lasting sense of peace.
It's a very minimalist approach in some ways, but it doesn't have to mean living an austere or solitary life, does it? After all, Epicurus himself placed great importance on friendship and community.
You're right to point that out. Epicurus recognized that social connection is fundamental to human happiness. He saw isolation as a major source of unhappiness and encouraged his followers to gather, to share meals, engage in discussions, and support each other.
Which ties back beautifully to his idea of minimizing pain by strengthening our connections with others. It's about finding our tribe, people who share our values and enrich our lives through shared experiences. It's a powerful antidote to the loneliness and isolation that many people feel today.
Absolutely. It's about prioritizing those relationships that nourish our souls, that bring joy and laughter and a sense of belonging.
So it seems that Epicurus offers us a path to happiness that balances our inner and outer worlds, finding peace within ourselves while also nurturing those essential social bonds. But inner peace, that feels like a moving target sometimes. How did he believe we could achieve that sense of calm in a world that often feels anything but peaceful?
Epicurus emphasized the importance of training our minds, of cultivating a sense of detachment from the things that trigger our anxieties. He was an early advocate for what we might call mindfulness today.
It's about being present in this moment, without getting bogged down by worries about the past or anxieties about the future. It's about letting go of those thoughts that spiral out of control and disrupt our peace. Easier said than done, right?
It takes practice, and it's a lifelong pursuit. But by cultivating this inner stillness, we become more resilient, more capable of weathering life's storms.
It's like building an inner fortress of peace that can withstand even the most chaotic external forces. And to think, Epicurus was advocating for these practices over 2,000 years ago. It's testament to how deeply he understood the human condition.
Exactly. And what makes his philosophy so enduring is that it's not about adhering to a rigid set of rules. It's a framework for living a good life, adaptable to our individual needs and circumstances.
He's not prescribing, but rather suggesting. It's an invitation to experiment, to discover what works for us, and to chart our own path to happiness.
It's a philosophy of empowerment. Epicurus reminds us that we have far more agency in creating our own happiness than we often realize. It's not about external circumstances dictating our state of mind, but rather about choosing how we respond to those circumstances.
What a powerful message. It's a call to action disguised as ancient philosophy.
That's a great way to put it.
So, if someone listening today is feeling lost, overwhelmed, or simply unsure of how to navigate life's challenges, what would be the one takeaway you hope they remember from Epicurus?
That happiness is an inside job. It's not something that happens to us. It's something we cultivate through our choices, our outlook, and our relationships.
It's about taking ownership of our own well-being, about recognizing that even in a world that often feels chaotic, we have the power to find peace, joy, and a deep sense of contentment. Epicurus was onto something, wasn't he?
He was.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the world of Epicurus. His wisdom feels as relevant today as it did centuries ago, and I think we can all benefit from revisiting his ideas and finding ways to weave them into our own lives.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.